Imagine if Dark Souls in a peaceful indie adventure game had a very weird child. I mean, it would probably be Ashen. And somehow, against all odds, it actually works. This is one of those games I went into expecting a budget Souls clone like the usual, but instead I found one of the weirdest, most relaxing, and honestly, one of the most underrated Souls likes I've ever played in a while. Because Ashen is not the kind of game that grabs you in immediately. It doesn't hit you with some insane intro cutscene. It doesn't throw a giant boss at you in the first 10 minutes. It doesn't scream at you like, hey, I'm the next Dark Souls. It just kind of quietly exists. And somehow that ended up being exactly why I liked it so much. Now, the funny thing is, Ashen doesn't exactly make the greatest first impression. You boot up the game, and the first thing you get is the character creator. And when I say character creator, I mean you just basically decide what your character looks like and just move on with your life. That's it. No classes, no stats, no choose your warrior path moment, no starting as a knight, a mage, a rogue, or even an archer. You just make a person. And then the game pretty much goes, well, cool, good luck out there, which honestly caught me off guard. Because in most Souls likes, the beginning usually tries to sell you on how deep the build system is gonna be. Ashen does the opposite. It's weirdly simple. At first, it almost made it feel kind of cheap. Like I was sitting there thinking, alright, is this gonna be one of those games that's technically inspired by Dark Souls, but doesn't really have the sauce? And then I got into the game. And for the first hour, I was still not fully convinced. Because the movement felt a little stiff, the attacks felt a little sluggish, and the overall animation has this slightly floaty, awkward feel to it at first. Not terrible, just not instantly satisfying enough to actually pull me in. And I'm not gonna lie, I almost bounced off because of that reason alone. Because the weird thing about Ashen is, the longer I played it, the more I started realizing that first impression is kind of misleading. Because once Ashen settles in, you start noticing that it's not really trying to be flashy. It's not trying to out Dark Souls. It's doing its own thing. The world is quiet, the art style is super minimal, the music barely shows up half the time, and instead of trying to overwhelm you with detail, it just gives you space. That's probably the first thing I genuinely liked about it. Ashen feels less like a game that actually wants to punish you, and more like a game that wants you to actually exist in its world for a while. Which sounds dramatic, I know, but I mean it. A lot of Souls likes are so focused on difficulty, aggression, giant bosses, giant weapons, giant men screaming at you. Ashen feels like it took one look at all that and said, okay, but what if we chilled out a little? And somehow that actually makes the game stand out way more than I expected. And I think the biggest reason Ashen works for me is the exploration. This is where the game really started winning me over. Because even though it has all the usual Souls like DNA, stamina management, dodging, careful combat, healing, checkpoints, the actual feeling of moving through the world is way different. Ashen's world feels lonely, but not miserable, and that's a huge difference. Dark Souls feels like the world is cursed and wants you dead. Ashen feels like the world ended a long time ago, and now everyone's just kind of trying their best to live. And that vibe carries the whole game. You're wandering through ruins, cliffs, caves, villages, and giant open areas, and the game constantly gives you these little moments where you just stop and look around. Not because there's some giant lore item glowing in the distance, but because the world itself is just nice to be in. And I know that sounds weird for a Souls like, but that's kind of what makes it special. Ashen doesn't always have the most complex level design in the genre, and we both know that it's not gonna outdo From Software in that department. But it nails something a lot of Souls likes completely miss. It makes exploration feel quite inviting. Don't get me wrong, you still have the danger, you still have the tension, and you can still get ambushed by enemies that absolutely do not respect your personal space at all. But there's also this constant feeling of curiosity. Like, wait a minute, what's over there? Can I get down from there? Why does that cave look like it wants to ruin my day? And because the game isn't constantly trying to annihilate your will to live for every 5 seconds, you actually want to keep moving forward. And that matters way more than people think now. Because for a lot of casual players, that's the part of Souls likes they actually want. The mystery, the atmosphere, and that simple sense of discovery. Not necessarily getting curb stomped by a 7-foot skeleton with no way of beating in the early game. And then there's the companion system, which is probably one of the most interesting things about Ashen. This is one of the game's biggest hooks. A lot of the time, you are not traveling alone. You'll have an AI companion with you through large parts of the game, and that changes the entire feel of the actual experience. Because suddenly, this super quiet, lonely world doesn't feel completely empty. You still feel isolated, don't get me wrong, but not abandoned. And that balance is actually really important. Well, sometimes your companion helps in combat, sometimes they draw the aggro for bosses and monsters, sometimes they save you, and sometimes they do what all AI companions do in video games, which is stand in the doorway like they pay rent. But overall, I actually liked having them around. It makes Ashen feel less oppressive than most Souls likes, and that's clearly intentional. This isn't a game that wants every fight to feel like solo death march. It wants you to feel like you're surviving in a broken world with other people. And that ties directly into the game's sub and progression system too. Because as you keep playing, you can now meet new characters, bring them back, and now your settlement slowly grows. And for me, that is such a cool touch. Instead of just collecting NPCs who sit in random corners, Ashen actually makes them a part of your home. You are helping rebuild the community, and that gives the game this really nice sense of progression beyond just the numbers and the gear. You are not just getting stronger, you are making the world feel a little less sad and dead. And that's a surprisingly effective motivator, well, for me. And it gives the journey a lot more warmth than I expected from a Souls-like. And honestly, that might be one of the reasons the game stuck with me. And now you slowly understand what kind of place this really is. And honestly, that works in its favor. Because the game's story isn't really about some huge dramatic twist. It's more about the tone. It's about the feeling that humanity is hanging on by a thread but not giving up. That's what makes Ashen feel so different from a lot of other games in this genre. Most Souls-likes are obsessed with decay, suffering, and destruction. Ashen still has a bleak world, but there's this quiet optimism under all of it. It feels like a world trying to come back to life, and that little shift in tone does a lot. It makes the game feel less exhausting. It makes the world feel worth saving. And for me, that made the whole experience more memorable than I expected. And now let's talk about the combat, because this is where I think people are either gonna click with Ashen or bounce off immediately. Like I said earlier, the combat felt a little sluggish to me at first. Your movement isn't super snappy, your attacks don't have that immediate from soft feel, and there's a slight weight to everything that can feel awkward when you're starting out. And if you go in expecting it to feel exactly like Dark Souls, well, you're probably gonna be disappointed. But once I adjusted to Ashen's rhythm, I actually started enjoying it a lot more. Because under that slightly janky first impression, the combat is still very solid. You've got stamina management, dodge timing, spacing, enemy patterns, and that once familiar Souls like loop of, okay, I died because I got greedy, that one's on me. And the nice part is, because there are no strict classes, the game feels way more flexible than it first appears. At the beginning, that lack of classes feels so underwhelming, but later on, I actually kind of appreciated it, because instead of locking you into some identity immediately, the game just lets your playstyle develop naturally. You find gear, you find weapons, and then you experiment, and then you lean into what feels good. It's simple, but in a weird way, that simplicity works. Ashen isn't trying to drown you in systems. It gives you enough to engage with without turning the first 2 hours into a build craft spreadsheet. For a lot of players, that's probably a good thing, especially if you're curious about Souls likes but don't necessarily want to spend your first hour researching whether your stat allocation accidentally ruined your bloodline. And that leads to the biggest reason why I think Ashen is so easy to recommend: the difficulty. Now, to be clear, this is still a Souls-like. The game can absolutely humble you in ways you never imagined. You can still get overwhelmed, you can still make bad decisions, you can still walk into an area and immediately realize you were not emotionally prepared for what's in there. But compared to a lot of other games in the genre, Ashen feels way more approachable. And I don't mean easy in a bad way. I mean, it feels like a game that actually understands why some people want to like Souls likes but never fully get into them. Not everyone wants a game that feels like a full time job, not everyone wants every boss to feel like a 6 phase divorce, and not everyone wants to spend 40 minutes finding something that looks like a cathedral with anger issues. Ashen gives you a challenge, but it usually feels manageable. It feels fair more often than not. And because the game is less obsessed with destroying you at every opportunity, it gives you more room to appreciate everything else. The world, the atmosphere, the journey, the slow growth of your village, the companions, the discoveries. That balance is exactly why I think this game lands so well. So why is Ashen underrated? Honestly, because it doesn't advertise itself well. It doesn't look as flashy as other Souls likes, it doesn't have the insane boss spectacle people expect. Its art style is simple, its animations can feel awkward, its opening doesn't immediately blow you away. And in a genre full of games desperately trying to prove how hardcore they are, Ashen just kind of quietly does its own thing. And I think a lot of people probably bounced off before they got to what makes it special. Because if you give it time, Ashen reveals itself as something way more interesting than just indie Dark Souls. It's a Souls like that actually feels welcoming. Not easy, not perfect, but welcoming. It captures the exploration, the tension, the atmosphere, and that feeling of being on a long journey through a strange world without making the entire experience feel like it hates you. And honestly, that alone makes it stand out more than a lot of bigger, louder games in the genre. So no, I don't think Ashen is the best Souls-like ever made, but I do think it's one of the most overlooked. And if you've ever liked the idea of Souls-like more than actually playing them, Ashen might be one of the best places to start. And yeah, I kind of ended up liking it way more than I expected.